On. Hi, Genesis.
Hey, Professor.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
So I have a question about the final, but specifically my email.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so have you seen my last two emails regarding the date change for my final?
Regarding, sorry, what?
Remember how I emailed you about the family issue that I have going on the 15th?
Yes.
I mean 16th, I'm sorry. Yes,
Yes.
I followed up with that, and I told you in the email that I can do it the day after at the same time. So I'm just wondering if
That's
that's okay.
yes, that will be fine.
Okay, perfect. Because I was just wondering, because you haven't responded, so I just wanted to make sure.
I can't recall having seen them. I'm sorry. I'll check through again, but I think that will be fine.
Hey,
Okay, as long as that's okay, that's all that I'm worried about. Okay.
Yeah, no, that will be fine. Hi, Nicholas.
Question. Are we going over something new, or are we gonna like go over like the final and stuff?
No, we're going through something new. Is there something you particularly want to do?
Oh no, I was just asking if we were gonna go over like a little bit of the final, because it is like a lot of information to know. So we wanted to know like if we can have like maybe like 10 minutes at the end of class, like just go over a couple questions. It's not
Of course.
all but like general based questions that we should know.
Yes, sure, of course.
Right.
But would you rather? The only thing is that this class that I've set for today is very lengthy and quite complicated, and I'm wondering if we couldn't. Tomorrow is going to be difficult. We could set aside some time tomorrow to meet.
Okay, that's fine.
Would you like to do that? Would you like me to set up a meeting for where people can come and ask questions?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you.
All right, then let's do that. I'm not even sure how much of this class today I'm going to get through. I don't think I'll get through the whole thing.
Okay,
but we'll do what we can. All right.
Okay.
Just let me make a note. Okay. No, my things disappeared again. Okay, everybody. So I just wanted to finish off by discussing a little bit about what we refer to as macroevolutionary processes. I'm only going to be able to skim through this. It's actually a lengthy and complex chapter, but I did want to leave you just with some of the ideas about what have driven the kind of major changes in organisms and in the groups of organisms that we see. And the processes that we talked about before, the changing of alleles, changing proportions of alleles, those sorts of things. Those we refer to as microevolutionary processes. And certainly they are the basis of all evolutionary processes. They're the basis of all descent with modification. But over long spans of time, major evolutionary change, major establishment of new major groups, that we refer to as macroevolutionary change, and is often linked with sets of processes which we could almost term geologic. It's tied to major changes very often in structure of the Earth, in the way that the Earth is functioning, and that sort of thing. Let's just review what we had talked about before, about how organisms descend from common ancestry. If we look at a tree of common ancestry through all the time that organisms have existed on the planet, which is close to 4 billion years, we assume that we actually all have a common ancestor. There's a common ancestor to all life. There are some things about this tree, though, that are really important. The first is that many of groups which arise actually end up going extinct with no further descent with modification. The lineage ends in extinction. This is frequent throughout the evolutionary tree that we see. There are major changes taking place on the Earth throughout its history. For the period that we are talking about, the one major thing that we need to consider is that the continents themselves have, the distribution of the continents has changed. And this has been a major driving force in macroevolutionary change, because it's forced different groups apart from one another. It's forced them into new climatic areas and all of this sort of thing. The other thing that we need to take note of, when we look through all of evolutionary history, there are several periods where all of a sudden many lines of descent end in extinction. These we call mass extinction events, and there have been several of them. We'll see in a minute that there have been several of them, and the causes of those mass extinctions may be very different. The one, of course, that we immediately think of is the mass extinction that ended the dinosaur line. If it ended it, many people think the dinosaurs are still present as the birds, but certainly there was a mass extinction event about 65 million years ago, and the really large dinosaurs and everything died out at that time. That we believe caused by the impact of an asteroid. But there are some other processes to remember as well. And for instance, the founder effect that we talked about frequently leads in the evolutionary tree to the sudden radiations. And in actual fact, these sudden radiations can also occur as a result of mass extinction, as survival of mass extinctions. The radiation of the mammals is an example. Once the dinosaurs were rendered extinct, the mammals radiated very rapidly. So these are the kinds of massive changes that we observe as we look through evolutionary history. In looking at the fossil record, we realize that, first of all, organisms have existed in places which are now totally different to their original situation. Second of all, we look in the fossil record, we realize that many things that we see in the fossil record have gone extinct, but that the fossil record also can tell us a story. And have a look here, for example. This is a fossil found in the middle of the Sahara, in the middle of the Sahara Desert, but it's a whale. Not only is it a whale, it's an ancestral whale. It's a primitive whale. And when we look at fossil record and we look at our modern whales, we can put them together in a story. Not only is was this whale fossil deposited in what is now in the middle of a desert, it was obviously originally the geological strata and everything were on the seabed. And massive changes have led to this fossil now being placed in the Sahara. But the fossil also tells us a story about how whales came to be. This fossil is an intermediary form. It's not a modern whale. It's clearly a whale, but it links much older fossils with our modern whales. So those are that is a kind of this is a kind of a macroevolutionary process frozen for us. What we're seeing here, there's some massive geologic change has taken place, right? Former seabed has been raised up into the middle of a continent. Former aquatic environment is now in the middle of the desert. A former ancestral whale form is frozen in time in this fossil for us to see.
Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
What's the name of this like chapter? Like, is it just macroevolution? Is that the name of the chapter?
No, it's I think it's called Life on Earth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Where was I? Okay. All right. So let's try. We're going to try in our hour and a half to cover as much of Earth history as we possibly can. We're going to start 4.5 billion years ago, which was the formation of the planet. Our planet at its origins had a lengthy history when there was no, for instance, there was no water on the surface of the planet. It was too hot. And water was immediately vaporized. And it was only about 4 billion years ago that the seas began to form. The early atmosphere of the planet had no oxygen. The reason for that was oxygen is extremely reactive, and oxygen reacted predominantly with all of the metal ions that were present in the Earth crust and got bound into compounds in the Earth crust. So there was no free oxygen. There was lots of water vapor though. And as the planet solidified from an early molten phase, there was a tremendous amount of volcanic activity. And volcanic activity released a huge number of compounds into the atmosphere. Nitrogen compounds, oxygen and nitrogen compounds combined. Even a primitive organic molecule, methane, which was formed not by biological processes, but by geologic processes. Ammonia, all sorts of things which could conceivably serve as building blocks of true organic matter. This fascinated these workers, Miller and Urey, who performed these very elaborate experiments over a very long period of time in which they tried to reproduce the atmosphere of the Earth, the early atmosphere of the Earth. So they set up these systems where there was no oxygen, these were free of oxygen, and they put into the experiment those early compounds that they believed had been released from volcanoes and volcanic activity, that sort of thing. Water, methane, ammonia, free hydrogen. And it was suggested that the Earth's atmosphere, the primitive atmosphere, was very rich in hydrogen, that it was a reducing atmosphere. Miller and Urey strongly believed that it was lightning, which was the key feature of the early atmosphere. The huge amount of volcanic activity, they believed, sparked almost continuous lightning storms. And they passed an electric spark through these gases and then condensed the products of that and collected it here. And sure enough, they were able to recover from this experiment quite complex organic molecules. And they, for example, collected amino acids, nucleotides, and even small nucleotides joined together. So this gave rise to this idea that indeed a non-biological, an abiotic system could in fact end up synthesizing small organic molecules, and that those organic molecules could act as monomers, that they could form monomers which would join together to form polymers. There is some argument about how those joinings took place, but it in fact can be done experimentally in a completely non-biologic system. Take those monomers and get them to join together to begin to form molecules which were true macromolecules, true biological, true macromolecules which resemble those we see now biologically. But these primitive molecules would have had to have been contained. They would have had to be contained somehow in a primitive cell inside a membrane. Because think back and remember what I told you about the significance of the cell membrane, of the plasma membrane. A plasma membrane, whether it's a cell membrane around the outside of the cell or a membrane around an organelle, the membrane allows the inside to be different to the outside. It allows the concentration of and retention of important molecules. If the membrane is not there, those molecules simply get dispersed by diffusion. They just simply diffuse into solution. These primitive enclosures, these protocells, you can actually do in the absence of, or you can actually make them in the absence of a biological system. If you simply take phospholipids, think back to when we talked about the membrane, and I told you if we take phospholipid, which was one of the sets of molecules which were formed in the Miller-Urey experiment, for example, if we take phospholipids and we shake them up in water, they spontaneously form a double lipid membrane. In the absence of anything living, they spontaneously form these lipids, and those vesicles that they form could contain these original primitive molecules. So we can conceive of this all just happening by chance. Oh, it happens over the span of about 500 million years. So it's a long, long time that these processes are going on to create these not yet living protocells. But the key that takes that from a non-living to a living system is that we have to have some control mechanism. We have to have some molecule in there which will not only affect control over the processes taking place, but will allow the system to replicate itself, to self-replicate. So somewhere at the end of these processes, to move now to a living system, there had to be the evolution of a self-replicating molecule. No, by the way, this is just a side arm to this. Miller's results using his primitive atmosphere, we've actually found since then that these processes of creating organic molecules can take place under several circumstances, especially under volcanic systems, and especially under volcanic systems under the sea. For instance, at deep sea vents, there is the spontaneous generation of these organic compounds, of these primitive organic compounds. So it wasn't only in the atmosphere that these were being produced and then raining down into the seas. These may also have been processes that were ongoing at volcanic vents and things like that. Meteorites also serve as a source of organic molecules. And if you look at meteorites are like a snapshot of the formation of the galaxy. And if you look at in meteorites, you will find that they actually contain organic molecules like amino acids, lipids, simple sugars, all of these things, all of which over a long period of time would have contributed to what ended up being a soup. The seas became a soup of these organic molecules. The very first genetic material, we believe, was actually RNA, not DNA. We believe the DNA evolved later after RNA. And there are several reasons for this. First of all, RNA's role in synthesizing of proteins. That seems like a critical function of RNA. But second of all, when you look at RNA molecules, they are actually extremely diverse. There are several different kinds of RNA, and several of them are enzymatic. And under experimental conditions, we can actually get some of those enzymatic RNA molecules, which we call ribozymes. We can get them to actually replicate small complementary pieces of themselves, of RNA, under experimental conditions. They don't do this normally. But it suggests to us that, in fact, at one time, RNA was the original nucleic acid, and that RNA was not only responsible for protein synthesis, but was responsible for its own replication as well. So we've already seen, I showed you the shot of the whale fossil out there in the middle of the desert. The fossil record has been our most important source of information about macroevolutionary change during the history of life on Earth. Although most of the fossils that we refer to are present in sedimentary rock and accumulated as geologic sediments are accumulated, there are other kinds of fossils as well. These are plant fossils in rock. And what you see is effectively an impression left behind of the original organism. But there are very frequently, when organisms are fossilized, the organic matter that makes up the organism is replaced by minerals, is replaced often by silica. This petrified tree, for example, in Arizona, it's incredibly old, 215 million years old. And it has been entirely replaced by silica compounds. But the remarkable thing is that if you examine this microscopically, it reproduces the very, very fine microscopic structure absolutely faithfully. The fine microscopic structure is preserved.
Wait, Professor?
Yes.
I have a question. So how exactly do they know that this is, like, for example, the plant fossil, how do they know that's 300 million years old? Like, how do they know it's not older, or if it's a lot, like, younger? Like, how do they know it's about 300 million years ago? Like, how do they know that?
One of the ways, I can't go into all of the detail, but one of the ways is that we can actually date these strata now, and we date them with radioisotopes. You've heard of carbon dating, right?
Yeah.
Right. Carbon dating can only be used actually up to about 70,000 years ago. This fossil here, this is a wolf pup. It was frozen in the permafrost. This is 50,000 years old. That we could date with carbon dating. This age here, we usually use radioisotopes that are associated with volcanic eruption. And you can date very, very much further back than that. Other than that, the ages can just be estimated from the depths of the strata that they live in. and knowing the rates of deposition and that sort of thing. But those dates nowadays are confirmed with radioisotope dating. So these dates are pretty good. And when we look at DNA sequence, you can also use DNA sequence as a dating mechanism as well. In other words, I don't want to go on and on into all of the detail, but there are several ways in which dating is done. The dates on there, you can't, that about is very important. Okay, about 215 million years. There's definitely uncertainty, but nonetheless. Okay, so we've got things like the fossilized trees. We've also got trace fossils. Trace fossils are things like footprints, burrows, this sort of thing left by organisms. And we have these are footprints, dinosaur footprints. There are many, many dinosaur tracks, especially here in the United States. There are several places where dinosaur tracks are very important fossils because they tell us all sorts of things. They tell us about the size of the animal, the weight of the animal, how they moved, etc. This is an insect frozen in amber. These are of tremendous interest, of course. If you've seen Jurassic Park, there's one thing that is correct about Jurassic Park, and that is that we can actually use these to extract DNA. So we can use not dinosaur DNA, but the insect DNA we can actually extract. And the same is true for this here. This is the frozen wolf pup that I mentioned, and things like the wolf pup. We've also got birds, mammoths, all sorts of now extinct animals recovered from ice, and that increases our chances of being able to recover DNA from them in order to examine the DNA and determine the genetic sequence. Okay, so from all of that, we can draw some conclusions. First of all, many, in fact, most past organisms are very unlike those that are alive today, although we may see relationship to things that are alive today. Second of all, extinction is the rule of the game. Many organisms that were once extremely common, dominant organisms, in fact, have now gone extinct and have left no living relatives, no living descendants. However, we do see that the whole groups of organisms that we see today are definitely related to previously existing ones. And the one that springs to mind immediately are the birds. If we look at the birds, at their structure, their function, and everything else, we realize that they are very closely related to the dinosaurs that no longer exist. But the birds appear to have arisen from common ancestry with the dinosaurs. So there is a very good example of a group which rose to prominence after the extinction of another group. However, using the fossil record, there are some caveats. The fossil record is extremely incomplete. Organisms were very seldom fossilized, even though we may find many fossils of a particular group. Overall, fossilization was rare compared to the number, just one sec, the number of organisms that were actually alive. Yes, go ahead.
When you're saying that the fossil records were incomplete, do you mean that there were large gaps in between different fossil,
yes,
like actual physical fossil evidence?
Yes. Okay. There are huge gaps. How come I don't see you on my list? I can't see you on mine. Yes, I can't see you.
Maybe I'm.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm probably on the bottom or something like that.
Okay, so. All right, so yes, the fossil record is very incomplete for virtually every group that we look at. There are gaps, and we have to make inferences from the fossil record. The fossils are frequently destroyed, quite apart from anything else, the huge geologic processes have taken place, let's say, in the last 500 million years. Huge geological processes, upheavals, earthquakes, splitting up of continents and everything. And many of the fossils would simply have been lost. And there are a lot out there that we still need to discover. And so we also have to be judicious about using fossils. We don't want to try and extract more information from them than there is for them to give us. The fossil record is very biased because it tends to it doesn't preserve soft tissue well. That's the first thing. It tends to preserve hard things like shells, exoskeletons, skeletons themselves, but not soft tissue. And it very often would have been the soft tissue structures that we would be really interested in. It also, of course, is biased towards those things which were very common. But nonetheless, we depend very heavily on the fossil record. And we, in fact, base our understanding of geology on fossils. And we use fossils to provide boundaries between geologic times. So I'm not going to go through the whole geological record. I'll simply point out to you. We begin about 4.6 billion years ago, and that is called the Archean. The Archean gave way to this. It's called the Neo-Proterozoic. That was the era of early life. This is the next is the era of the Paleozoic, which is the era of ancient life. Then Mesozoic. The Mesozoic is the one that everybody seems to be most fond of, the age of the reptiles. And then the Cenozoic, which is our era. Okay. If you want to try and remember it, you can do so. If I can remember it, eager, camels, over, sandy, deserts, carry pilgrims to, convey pilgrims to Jerusalem. Carry passports. Each one must present personal. Holocene is also called the recent. So you go, each one must present personal references. Are you going to remember that? No, I don't think so. Each of these, each boundary here, you don't need to remember everything, but each boundary is marked by distinct changes in the fossil record. Very often there are marker fossils for each of these little periods that we separate off. These here, the major boundaries here, are often marked by mass extinctions. So, for example, at this here, there was not only was there a mass extinction of everything that had occurred before, there was an explosion of new forms straight afterwards. Here's one of the greatest mass extinctions of all here. Huge, huge animal groups that were dominant in the oceans, the trilobites, for example, disappeared entirely, suddenly, very, very suddenly here. Here, this is the age of the dinosaurs. Here, 66 million years ago, was the mass extinction that led to the end of the era of the dinosaurs. So these great boundaries here, often marked by mass extinction. These boundaries here, often marked by changes in groups, evolution of new groups, that sort of thing. This is often presented as a sort of a clock. You'll either see it for a day or you'll see it for an hour like this. And it's kind of humbling to look at. Here is the origin of the solar system and the formation of the Earth. We could say 5 billion, 4.6 billion years, 5 billion years ago. The planet existed completely free of life for a very, very long time. until such time as conditions for where life could exist, the correct temperatures, that sort of thing, correct pH, were established. And the very first prokaryotes were produced here. So that's about 15 minutes, the first prokaryotes. So the prokaryotes have existed for a very, very long time. For a long time, there was no free oxygen in the atmosphere. Free oxygen arises here at what? About 25 minutes. So this atmospheric oxygen begins to build up. The first eukaryotes, the single-celled eukaryotes, at about 35 minutes. The first multicellular at about 45 minutes. The first animals here at about 50 minutes. And just come all the way around to us, humans, Homo sapiens, about 200,000 years. We're nothing but a little blip. We're tiny, a tiny little blip. In fact, the hominins, our associated species, oh, not much longer than that, about 6 million years or so. So hardly even feature on this clock. So we're going to have a look at some of these different events. So have a look here, and you see the origin of the prokaryotes, the first bacterial cells. And for a very long time, they existed in an atmosphere with no oxygen whatsoever, with no free oxygen. There was certainly oxygen present on the planet, but it was bound up into compounds like water, and then also bound to metal ions like iron. There was a huge crisis, however, in prokaryote world. And that was that most prokaryotes existed on the soup of organic molecules, which had been created not by living things, but by non-living processes. It had produced literally a soup in the sea of these organic molecules out of which life had arisen, but now that life depended on. And as those molecules got used up, these living things began to run out of molecules to live on. It was a finite resource until the evolution around about here of a set of prokaryotes which could actually use sun's energy and simple compounds, carbon dioxide and water, in order to make their own organic molecules. And these were the autotrophs. It was that process of photosynthesis evolved in a group of the autotrophs called the cyanobacteria. And as they began to produce oxygen, first of all, the first thing that happened was all the oxygen that they produced as a result of photosynthesis got bound up by iron. And there was a long period of time when this iron oxide rained out of the seas and formed huge geological bands. We can see it as these banded iron oxides, and they are all occurring, being laid down around here. But eventually, enough oxygen was produced that it began to build up in the atmosphere, and we began to have atmospheric oxygen build up. That was a second crisis. Crisis number one, we're running out of food. Crisis number two, most living things were very susceptible to oxygen. They got killed by oxygen because oxygen is such a reactive molecule. It reacts with biological molecules and it kills things. We can just jump here. Those first photosynthetic organisms, we have very good fossil record of them, called the stromatolites. And they occur around about here, about 3 billion years ago. That's where they start to build up. They produced masses and masses of oxygen. It's called the oxygen revolution. and it actually wiped out most living things. And in order to survive, living things evolved the system of respiration. Respiration, cellular respiration, evolved initially not to produce energy, but to protect organisms from oxygen. And once they'd done that, then evolution could proceed. But there was a period of time when most living things died. It was our first great mass extinction, but it was an extinction of prokaryotes, not of eukaryotes. So that is this here. It occurs here. You can see how rapidly the oxygen built up in the atmosphere. There is a second boost here, which is due to more complicated reasons. It's because of continental drift changing oxygen currents. Ocean currents, rather. But this is the great one here. This is where the oxygen in our atmosphere first reached close to modern levels. So that is here. The first prokaryotes evolved here, and prokaryotes evolved from primitive cells, not the eukaryotes rather, evolved from primitive group of cells, the archaea, which took in prokaryotes as endosymbionts. That is, an archaeal cell took in things, for example, which could respire, and those formed the mitochondria. In plants, archaea took in organisms which could photosynthesize, prokaryotes which could photosynthesize. Those went on to form the chloroplasts in the plants. So these are the simple eukaryotes here. And they're initially single-celled. It took a long time before they formed multicellular forms. Here we're almost 45 minutes, or 15 minutes to midnight, 45 minutes on our clock. And the first multicellular eukaryotes have only just arisen. Let me just, I'm having to flip a little bit quickly to get through this. So when you talk about multicellular organisms, we have not very good fossil record, but we do have some. And this here is an animal, a multicellular animal called an ediacaran. We don't know much about them. They must have been fairly common for quite a long time, but they died out absolutely entirely. We have nothing which even closely resembles them. This, however, is a plant. It's a multicellular plant, and it's a red alga. And there are many, many which are quite similar to that, still extant. I just want to flip back to something here. I should have brought it forward. I just want to flip all the way. Where am I? No. Here. I just want to show you here. We're up to about here. We've got multicellular, simple multicellular plants, and we've got simple multicellular animals. And these are the ediacaran. The animals are called the ediacarans, and they suddenly die out here. And we move now into the area of the Paleozoic, and this in here, there is a sudden explosion of new animal forms. We do not exactly understand why, but we do know that there is, all of a sudden, most of the modern phyla that we recognize evolved immediately before the Cambrian, the time of the Cambrian. So this is referred to as the Cambrian explosion. And the fossils of the Cambrian period are absolutely extraordinary in their diversity. But many, many of them have persisted as groups. A lot of them haven't, but many of them have persisted as groups that we still see today. And they originated there at that boundary between the Ediacaran and the Cambrian. Here's just one of them. And this one I put here because it's got the best name ever. This is called hallucinogenia. And it is literally hallucinogenic. These are the actual fossils here. And this is a reconstruction of the animal itself. How it functions, we don't know. But it is just one of these extraordinary animals that suddenly appear in the Cambrian. And many of the groups that still persist today, they originated there. And so we are just about here. The animals, the ediacarans, would have been around here, and here, about here is the Cambrian. And shortly afterwards, we're going to see the first colonization of land. So these are some of the groups that evolved. They didn't evolve in the Cambrian, but they evolved in most of them immediately before the Cambrian, and then they diversified enormously as the Cambrian began. And we name the Cambrian, we label the Cambrian from that explosion of new forms. That is what characterizes the Cambrian for us. The sudden appearance of these many diverse groups. And we actually believe that one of the driving forces for that was the evolution of predation. Up until then, we believed most organisms seemed to have not actually hunted one another. They were how exactly they made their livings, we don't really know. But there's no evidence, for example, of jaws, or likewise of any protection from predation. Instead, in the Cambrian, all of a sudden we see the evolution of many different ways of predating, of hunting down and eating other things. And correspondingly, we see the evolution of many protective mechanisms. And when we look at hallucinogenia, that may indeed be what we're looking at. We may be looking at spines, exoskeletons, all of these things evolving to try and protect organisms from predation. Okay, so we also now move up. The pressures now in aquatic systems begin to become enormous. There's enormous number of different kinds of things. There's enormous numbers of organisms predating one another, competing with one another. There's now a tremendous pressure because there is on land open territory. There's no predation on land. What you have to worry about on land is drying out, that sort of thing, and also resisting gravity. Underwater you are supported by the water, by buoyancy. Come up onto land, all of a sudden you've got to fight gravity and you've got to fight dehydration. But nonetheless, organisms began to colonize land. The first were the fungi and the plants, but animals soon followed. And the first organisms, the first animals to move onto land were those who already had some adaptations which made it easier to be there. For example, the first groups to move onto land, animal groups to move onto land, were probably the arthropods, because they had an exoskeleton. The exoskeleton was easily adapted to resisting the force of gravity and allowing animals to still locomote. The exoskeleton also protected them from dehydration. And it's no surprise then that the arthropods began to be very successful up on land. And that was about 500 million years ago. And I should just mention that at the same time, major changes in the shape and the disposition of the continents is beginning. Continents are beginning to break up and move, and this is introducing new continental populations. If we have a continent which splits, it carries away one population from another, and it may take one population into a different climatic area while the other remains where it was before. all sorts of change begins to be forced onto the populations. The plants adapted very easily to life on land and began to penetrate far inside. If we look at land animals, the most diverse are the arthropods and the tetrapods. The tetrapods are our group, those animals which have 4 limbs. The arthropods are those with an exoskeleton. We say they were the first to colonize land. The tetrapods arose actually from a fish group, from a group of fishes which we call the lobe-finned fishes, and I mentioned them before when I told you about the lungfish. We actually saw the tetrapod tree with the lungfish on it once before, and that entry onto land by the lobe-finned fish was about 365 million years ago. Just contrast that to our own lineage. The primates, our hominin lineage diverged from the primates about 6 million years ago. We arose about 200,000 years ago. So we are very much youngsters in the story of entry onto land. I know I'm having to hurry through this and I'm leaving out enormously important areas. If you are interested, then you can read this section. But let's just talk a little bit about the evolution of our own group, which were the mammals. So we belong to this group called the tetrapods, and the tetrapods evolved on land from the fish line and then proceeded through a reptile line. There were 2 major reptile groups, and one of those groups was a group called the synapsids. And the synapsids are also sometimes known as the mammal-like reptiles. They were a very, very important group at one time, and then they ceased to diverge and ceased to be as successful as they had been because they got superseded by another group of true reptiles. And that was those true reptiles were the ones who eventually were to lead to the dinosaurs. As long as that whole line was busy evolving and diverging, this group of mammal-like reptiles became rather obscure and very nearly went extinct. But it would later give rise to the true mammals. So our mammal group arises from this group of tetrapods called the synapsids, also known as the mammal-like reptiles. And we actually now begin to get quite a good story in the fossil record. We have very good fossils all the way back to the mammal-like reptiles and onwards. And one of the things that we note as we go through is that the things like the reptiles, the true reptiles, they have, and the fish, all of those things, they don't really have much differentiation in their teeth. Their teeth tend to have a single root, and they tend to be all pretty much the same. Whereas the mammals in the mammalian jaw and teeth evolve to have differentiation. The different teeth have different functions. And that is one of the things that distinguishes both the mammal-like reptiles and mammals themselves. So here is a really brief synopsis of this tetrapod tree. And you'll see here, we share a common ancestor with all of the reptiles. This here is still really a reptile line, but this is a different group of reptiles. And these are the synapsids. Here you may recognize this. This is Dimetrodon. This is a true mammal-like reptile. And we definitely share ancestry with it. But here's the common ancestor. This led to this whole group here. And these here are actually not yet mammals. They're called the cynodonts. And we share relatively common ancestry with them. They're actually a very advanced mammal-like reptile, the cynodonts. And the mammals are actually quite close. And do you realize what this means? It means we are perilously close to being reptiles. And in fact, some evolutionary biologists very firmly state that the mammals are actually a reptile group, that we share common ancestry with the rest of the reptiles, and that our recent ancestry with the mammal-like reptiles suggests that that is what we are. We are an advanced mammal-like reptile, which is, I think, quite a nice thing to think about. Okay, so one of the things that we realize is that, as I showed you at the very beginning, these major processes of plate tectonics, for example, can lead to massive impacts on populations of organisms, especially those up on land, but also those in the sea, because as continental shape changes, new channels open up, new ocean currents are created, and conditions in the ocean may change very radically. But the impact on land is very, very great, because these continental plates can move enormous distances, and they can move into entirely new climatic areas, for example. This is one of the reasons why we see repeated mass extinctions in the fossil record. And mass extinctions are often followed by a sudden burst of radiation, adaptive radiation, a sudden appearance of new forms. And the reason for that is if after a mass extinction, many of the ecological niches are empty. After the mass extinction, the survivors move into those ecological niches, and we see a burst of evolutionary change that appears as sudden new forms in the fossil record or wherever. This plate tectonics is the process whereby continents move. And in actual fact, we have signs that there have been at least 3 major periods of such continental drift. But the one that interests us most is this one, which began about, it actually began about 500 million years ago, but it really, the continents actually began to split about 250 million years ago. So this theory suggests that, in fact, the continents are rather like islands floating on the mantle of the Earth, on the semi-fluid mantle, and that they can actually move across the mantle. As they do that, these plates, they can do all sorts of things. They can collide with one another. That is exactly what has happened. For example, India, the Indian continent has slid northwards and crashed into the Eurasian continent, creating the Himalayas. They can slide past one another, which is often a cause of earthquakes. They can slip underneath one another. All these kinds of processes are ongoing the whole time as a result of movement of these continental plates. So let's just have a look briefly. This is the current disposition. Let's just take Africa. Here's Africa here, and it's sitting on the African plate there. And you'll see that the African plate has boundaries to it. And those boundaries are often marked by a particular kind of geologic activity. The geologic activity along here is eruptive. It is erupting new crust to the earth, and is pushing this plate in this plate in this direction, this plate in that direction. So all along here, it's actually crashing into another plate there, and this is an area of a lot of earthquake activity because these plates are in opposition to one another. This is the Indian plate that I told you about. The Indian plate used to be down here, and it very rapidly moved up this way and smashed into this Eurasian plate. And here, where it's crashing in, the crust is rising to form the Himalaya mountains. So these are huge processes. But just think about this. The Indian plate used to be all the way down here. It used to be in a temperate zone. And it moved this entire Indian continent all the way north up here. Just think of the pressures of climate and everything else, the changes that took place as that happened. Here's another example for you. This little island, this island here of Madagascar, there. That island used to be part of the African continent. It was part of the African continent right at the beginning of the evolution of the mammals. And then it split. It split apart from Africa and separated, and that whole population got carried away. This population of animals here proceeded on its own line of evolution. A primitive group of mammals, of primates, called the lemurs, are still living here. The lemurs used to be very common here, all over Africa. They're extinct here, but they persist here and are very diverse. Here, the ancestors of the lemurs went on to form the higher primates, the monkeys, and then the apes. This is what I meant by it. The processes had begun about 500 million years ago. The continents began to get together into a single great continent here called Pangaea. About 135 million years ago, that great continent split into Laurasia and Gondwanaland, two great continents. 66 million years ago, the continents were splitting into their current disposition. Look at India. It's only halfway to Eurasia. Here's India here. Present day, here's our present disposition, but changes are still occurring. And one of the great changes is that the African continent appears to be splitting down the side here, like 1/3 over to the east, appears to be moving away. Okay, so just to emphasize the importance of these continental changes. When these supercontinents spread apart like this, populations on them get separated from one another and become isolated from one another, and then proceed along their own evolutionary tracks, remembering that conditions on those, as the continents move, conditions, especially climate conditions, may begin to change as the continent moves to different areas on the globe. This drives the development of new species, and not only new species, but of entire new groups. Here's another example for you here, and that is that of Australia. Have a look here, and you'll see that here, where Laurasia and Gondwanaland have only just split, here's Australia still attached. This is at the time when the mammals were just busy evolving, the primitive mammals. Australia then split off from Gondwanaland. It left behind all of the other mammals to evolve here, but in Australia, their line of evolution is much closer to their original form, and those are the marsupials. preserved in Australia. Also very rarely preserved in other places, but in Australia, very rich marsupial fauna, which disappeared in the rest of the world as the other more advanced mammals evolved. Okay, let's just have a look also at the importance of mass extinctions. Mass extinctions are marked in the fossil record where we suddenly see the disappearance of large numbers of groups. And this is usually on a worldwide basis. That we see in the fossil record, we see 5 great mass extinctions, several others which are not as pronounced. But we see huge groups of animals which suddenly disappear. Here are the 5 most important. There's this one here. This is the Ordovician, and this is the Silurian. Right in between them here, there is a mass extinction. This was of marine organisms. This one here, between the Devonian and Carboniferous here, there's one there. But this is the great one. This is called the Permian extinction. And this, in our terms, this is a very important one because it's around about this time there in the Permian that those mammal-like reptiles that I told you about were dominant. They were a huge, very important group, and they were spread over several of what are now separate continents. Very diverse, extremely successful. Many of them were herbivorous, but they were also very active predators amongst them as well. Huge, very diverse group, and all of a sudden, many of the mammal-like reptiles simply went extinct. Along with this, in this time here, there was a huge group of marine organisms, the trilobites, which disappeared entirely. They suddenly just disappear from the fossil record. Something cataclysmic happened here. There's a lot of theory as to what it might have been. It may have been an asteroid, that has been suggested. But there was also around about this time a huge amount of volcanic activity. All of a sudden, for some reason, all over the world, the volcanic areas became hyperactive. And there was huge changes. They produced masses of gases in the atmosphere, which warmed the atmosphere tremendously. So it was a period of global warming. There were all sorts of things happening which could have contributed to this. But this is the greatest mass extinction that we have so far, excepting for the one that we may be generating right now in our modern times. This one here is the mass extinction that everybody knows best. This is where most of the reptile groups went extinct, including the dinosaurs. We believe that this was due to an asteroid strike. But what this did was limping through here, literally limping through, were the remains of that group here, the mammal-like reptiles. And in this period here, the first true mammals evolved, but they remained extremely obscure. They were a small group. They were not extremely diverse, at least as far as we can tell from the fossil record, until this extinction here. And once all of these reptile groups and the dinosaurs went extinct, all of these ecological niches opened up and the mammals began to radiate and began to diversify into all the mammal forms that we see today. That is the Permian extinction. It was an extraordinary thing to think of. 96% of marine species became extinct in less than a million years, in 500,000 years, which is a flash in time on the geological scale. And really the best theory is that it was due to volcanism, but there is some suggestion that it could have also been due to an asteroid strike. Sorry for hurrying through this, but I want to kind of just at least touch on the major things. So the extinction that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs, that was about 66 million years ago. Also produced, it did not only wiped out the dinosaurs, it wiped out a huge group of marine organisms, which were the ammonites. And it also led to the demise of many, many terrestrial organisms, whole families of plants, animals. So about 50% of marine species and many, many, many other groups actually went extinct. It was obviously a global event. Somehow or other, something suddenly happened, which led to a global extinction event. And there is every evidence now to suggest that this was an asteroid strike, as you probably know, somewhere off the Yucatan Peninsula. We believe it was this. I cannot pronounce this, but this asteroid impact was so great that it led to the expulsion of a huge amount of matter and gases into the atmosphere. And what it probably did, quite apart from the effects of this huge blast wave, which radiated out for thousands upon thousands of miles, it induced sudden global climate change, which most organisms were not able to withstand. There may have also been some contribution already from volcanic activity. There's some indication from the fossil record, for example, that the dinosaurs were already becoming less and less diverse. So there may have been other things going on, but certainly the impacts of this huge asteroid on the Earth would have produced a global impact, not just the local. So we now, in our time, unfortunately, we are living through an extinction as well, and this induced by human beings. If we ignore the great mass extinctions, and we just look at the intervening periods, there is a certain rate at which extinction takes place normally in the fossil record. We are exceeding that rate at 100 to 1,000 times. Unfortunately, many of the things that we know are probably being impacted are things that we can't even name yet. For example, we believe that the insects are being particularly badly affected at current times, and that many insect species are going extinct before we even know what those insects are. This is being referred to as the sixth mass extinction. And there are certain things which are happening, which are contributing particularly to it. And one of them is that we are very, very badly affecting habitats which are the most diverse on the planet. For example, the rainforests are being destroyed at a very, very rapid rate. And rainforests are centers of biological diversity. The coral reefs are being very, very badly affected by changes taking place in the ocean, in particular because of ocean warming and because of acidification of the ocean waters as carbon dioxide builds up in the ocean. Coral reefs are also centers of biological diversity, and those centers of biological diversity, you must realize, are also centers of evolutionary change. That evolution works on that kind of diversity. It exploits that kind of diversity. Natural selection exploits difference. And as we eliminate those areas of of diversity, we also remove from future evolution all of those species. However, if that is, there are two ways to look at this. The first is to look at this and be very sorrowful that we're inducing these terrible changes on our planet, and often unnecessarily, for the worst reasons, for greed and everything else. That's one way to look at it. The second way to look at it is to go back here and have a look at these mass extinctions and realize that just enormous numbers of animals and plants have gone extinct. And that what heals that really is time. Those extinctions open up possibility of whole new groups arising. These are macroevolutionary changes, not microevolutionary changes. And all of those extinctions also inevitably lead to worldwide adaptive radiations. As I've given you the example, the dinosaurs and allied reptiles occupied many of the ecological niches on the planet. At the extinction, because of by pure chance, an asteroid strike took out many of those really, really important groups. They died out entirely. All of those ecological niches were open. And now this really obscure group of organisms, the mammals, were able to come in and begin to exploit all of those ecological niches. And so that we really have the mass extinction, the Cretaceous mass extinction, 66 million years ago. We have that extinction to thank for our existence, for the fact that we are here. Have a look here. This is the evolution of the mammals. We evolved from this ancestral organism. It was a mammal-like reptile, but an advanced mammal-like reptile. And it gave rise to two great groups of mammals. The first of these, this fascinating group here, the monotremes. These are reflective of our reptile ancestry. They are mammals. They have fur. They feed their young with milk, but they lay eggs. They lay eggs. That is really a reptile lays an egg with a shell. And it is the shell, it's that shell around the reptile egg that allowed reptiles to penetrate onto land. Frogs couldn't do it because they lay eggs with no shell around them and their eggs dry out. Reptiles could do it because they laid an egg with a shell around it, which regulated the loss of water. Here are mammals which lay eggs. It's a reflection of our common ancestry with the mammal-like reptiles. The other groups are these true mammals here, but the one surviving group, the marsupials, which are very primitive mammals, and then us, our whole group called the eutherians, the placental mammals. And look at how many species, 6,028 species. All of those species possible because of this radiation, this huge radiation here that was permitted by the mass extinction that took place 66 million years ago. Our current epoch has been designated by many geologists as the Anthropocene, the era that this is the epoch of man, because this one species, our single species, has been able to affect absolutely every aspect of nature on the planet. And though that impact, even if there's no single fossil of a human being left at the end of the Anthropocene, future geologists will be able to look and will be able to see that we were there. We did it because of the sudden loss of species, because of all sorts of other changes that have been induced just by this one species, us, Homo sapiens. We are the first species, the last species which could affect such radical change on a global scale was the cyanobacteria that evolved all those billions of years ago, nearly 3.2 billion years ago. The cyanobacteria evolved and changed global atmosphere by adding oxygen to it. Now here we are affecting global climate, radically impacting populations just by adding carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So we stand as human beings, we stand right at the edge of a mass extinction due to us, unless we do something about it. And you've sat through a whole semester of biology, you know it all now. So now you need to go out. You need to go out and ensure that this mass extinction does not happen. It'll happen. It'll happen up to a point, but how far the mass extinction goes is very much up to us. Okay, so on that sermonic note, I'll end. Do any of you have questions? I'm very sorry I had to tear through this section. If you're interested, read this, at least read this chapter through. There's a tremendous amount more information there in the book that you can make use of. I will set up a time tomorrow for us to, for you to be able to come and ask questions before your final on Wednesday. But for the moment, are there any other questions?
Is our finals gonna be on Canvas?
Yes, as before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Professor, we're gonna be able, I mean, I know you like did when I asked you originally so we could see if we made mistakes, we could view the mistakes.
Yes.
We'll be able to see that with the final, right? Like if we made a mistake.
Oh, yeah, yes. Eventually, I'll have to, I do have one or two people I've got to make accommodations for.
Mm-hmm.
For them to write later. So I can't have it posted until everybody's done. But it will I'll do that certainly by, let me see, certainly by the Monday.
So I mean, you're going to post like the answer key, right? You mean?
Yes, as it is now, where you can access the answers afterwards. I just need to set a date when it becomes available. That's all.
Okay. I understand. And then also, when we finish taking the test, if we, let's say, got like an 85, we'll be able to see, right, the questions that we got wrong? You know how it usually...
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you not...
No,
can you do that? Or
we can. It was at the beginning when we were taking your quizzes and tests, it was like we could see, like after you take the test, you could see how many what you got wrong. And then after that, for some reason, it stopped working. But then I told you, and then you fixed it, and now it works again. So I'm just asking, are you gonna?
I'll check that you can at least see which ones you got wrong.
Yeah,
once you submit.
That's what I wanted to know. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right then.
And then also the final assignment that you posted on my lab and mastering, that's just going to be like in case we don't do that well on the final, that could be like used as revisions.
Yes. You can also just read through it to revise for the final. But if you want to submit it, you have until Friday to do so.
No, I definitely want to because I feel like it's going to be great practice.
Okay. Sure.
Because I'm basically study mode right now.
All right, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, and then this is our last meeting,
go ahead.
Right?
Yes, this is our last class. Yeah.
Okay, it was a pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Edward. Thank you. I know that it's had its difficulties, but I still feel like people can still learn a lot, even though it's not ideal circumstances. All right then, everybody, thank you, and thank you all who have so faithfully attended these online classes. it does actually make a difference to be able to feel like I'm talking to real people. And I'll see you, I'll post a notice for a time tomorrow for us to meet for question time.
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you,
Have
Professor.
a nice day.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was a pleasure.
That's a pleasure.
Have a nice holiday too.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
For your holidays.
So I'd sort of forgotten that we have holiday. Where am I now? What's going on?